Like and subscribe, join the Discord server, join the Minecraft server. Now let's dive. Last week in the Zorro Ranch episode, we discussed one of the most disturbing aspects of what Epstein and Ghislaine did. And thank you, by the way, you guys, for the incredible support on that video. But the whole time I was making it, there was this nagging question at the back of my mind. A question that honestly should be really simple. That being, what were they like as children and what was the family dynamic like? A pretty basic question, I agree, but with a much stranger answer than you might expect. And all of this, I think, is about to give us a lot of answers into how these two became the monsters they are today. This may seem like an easy question, but it is so much harder than you think. And first off, for Jeffrey Epstein, there's almost no information on this man as a youth, which in my mind should only add to his suspicion. The extent of most people's knowledge about Epstein prior to his rise to prominence, diddying children, was that he got hired to work at some school in New York, but didn't have a college degree. So I sought to find out more than that. And as it turns out, Epstein was born in Seagate, Brooklyn on January 20th of 1953. Allegedly, he had only one brother named Mark, but more on that later. There were a handful of articles I could find that referenced an interview that someone conducted with some of Jeffrey Epstein's neighbors when he was a child. And all the reports state something to the following: that Epstein was a very gifted boy in math and general reasoning, most believing he was going to be plucked from obscurity and placed into some important role. And they were right, just probably not the way they expected. However, it was apparent that Epstein was a shy boy and didn't prefer playing with other people as much as he preferred studying at home. And all around, he was a little bit awkward. However, it does seem like he grew out of that, as by the time he made it to middle school and high school, he was known as quite the charmer. And in many regards, Epstein had to be. He was a Jew surrounded by Italians in Brooklyn in the mid-20th century. Jews were hated, and these Italians were concerned that the Jews were going to take over. Therefore, screaming matches and actual physical altercations were very common, with Jews and Italians often leaving school beaten. But never Epstein. He seemed to glide right past all of that. By the time he was a senior in high school, he was beloved, and even those who didn't fall under his charm still respected him. And this perceived status might be the origin story also of Jeffrey's affinity for younger girls, of which he received the attraction of many. And with that in mind, I don't say this lightly, but it is very likely that high school, middle school, and his entire school experience was the breeding ground for who Epstein would later become, as he quickly understood that saying the right things, holding the right ideas, and having access to the right things could get you anywhere in life. And as many know, after graduating high school, Epstein attended Cooper Union, where he studied physics for 2 years and then dropped out. And this explains Epstein's general early life. We do have more to get into later. However, it does leave out one major element: his parents, which are an interesting rabbit hole. Seymour George Epstein and his mother Pauline Epstein. Seymour was a gardener and Pauline was a school aide, supposedly. They were both first-generation Jews born in America, whose families had immigrated here from Russia. And I know this because I spent way too long sifting through genealogical records and even got a free trial for some crazy expensive website. And this is an important detail I realized because Russian Jews, especially during this time, were very heavily scrutinized for possibly being spies and plants from the Soviet Union, which was also coming of age as Epstein's parents were. And it's right here we can take two paths. Either you believe Seymour is his dad and everything's totally normal and his mom was totally normal, or we can do a hard right here and veer into this very interesting little side note that I've uncovered. And let's be honest, we're gonna do the latter. I cannot guarantee anything I'm going to say. This is speculation at its finest, but there are some strings that are coming together, and boy, in my mind, would it make more sense. It is worth noting that there is a man who shares Epstein's father's exact name, that being Seymour Epstein. This other Seymour was also born in New York around the same time as Epstein's dad. He, however, was not a gardener, but rather a physicist at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where he contributed to the development of advanced weaponry, including intelligent missiles and laser-guided systems. He also worked alongside the infamous Rosenbergs, who were two Jewish communists pretending to be Americans and working in high-tech and advanced industries in America. This other Seymour Epstein also had several children, and his office, where he worked out of, was only an hour drive from the Epstein family home. Now, I'm not saying I know it's the same guy, but with forged data, it could be. And it's worth noting that the person in charge of Jeffrey Epstein's genealogical records is a man named Randy Schoberg, and he manages over 235,000 separate records on these platforms and could make anything look a certain way if he wanted to. That's just speculation though, as stated. So let me get back on track. What's odd to me is that the Epstein family growing up is always described as this 4-person household, middle class but leaning towards the poorer side of the spectrum, when in reality that literally cannot be true. Because Seagate, where Epstein was born and raised, allegedly, was considered a wealthier area where, according to page 56 of the 1930 edition of the Menorah Journal, Seagate is referenced as being the place where the high-class Jews lived. And this was in the 1930s. By the time Epstein came around, Seagate was almost completely comprised of Jews. So perhaps the story Epstein told us about his upbringing, and it is Epstein from whom we get most of the story of his childhood, we could perhaps then make the assumption that Epstein at the very least was not quite the poor or middle-class kid that he pretended to be. Because it's just not possible that Epstein and his family could have lived in Seagate if his dad was a gardener and his mom was a teacher. They simply wouldn't have made enough money. Which contributes to the idea that his father may have actually been this other Seymour who was a physicist, possibly engaged in espionage because of his proximity to military secrets, as well as his Russian lineage and his friendship with the Rosenbergs, who were executed for espionage, and his muddled genealogical records that I have my questions about based on some research. For legal reasons though, that's just a thought. But in relation to Jeffrey Epstein's family, there is another bend in the rabbit hole. That being that there is some material that suggests Epstein has at least one sister. This is admittedly circumstantial, but with a creature like Epstein, we really do have to just grasp at any clues we can get our hands on, no matter how thin they may seem. And what's interesting about this potential sister named Jane is that firstly, she shares Jeffrey Epstein's last name. Secondly, she's the generally speaking right age of what a younger sister of Jeffrey would be. Thirdly, she's referenced in a few articles online. And fourthly, she's an activist who speaks out about, writes books, and holds events on a topic called SSA, seeking to help victims. Now, Cooper, you ask, what is SSA? Well, thank you for asking. SSA is sibling sexual assault. And this poor woman by the name of Jane Epstein, beginning at the age of 6 until 12 when her brother left for college, was consistently abused by her brother in varying degrees. Her brother, in her account, it is worth noting, is about 6 years older than her. And that's a really strange coincidence, especially assuming that Epstein's diddling behaviors likely didn't just appear out of nowhere. Indeed, we know he had them as early as his teaching days at Dalton, which would have been about 4 or 5 years after he left home. And it's worth noting that Jane Epstein has never publicly referenced the similarities her story shares with that of Jeffrey Epstein, but if true, this would explain a lot and unlock a previously unknown side of Epstein in his childhood. And the only other thing I could find on Epstein as a child that isn't well known came from the research done by a man named Nick Bryant. He uncovered that Jeffrey Epstein attended an arts summer camp in 1967 called Interlochen. And Epstein would later donate hundreds of thousands of dollars to this same camp and pick up children from it. But for our purposes, it's important to note that Interlochen is considered a prestigious and very expensive summer camp, which is frequently attended by the progeny of the wealthy and powerful, and would have been out of the range of most people financially, especially a family operating on a gardener's budget in 1967. Perhaps not so much a physicist though, like we referenced earlier. However, what's more interesting than the fact that Epstein attended this camp that he couldn't have afforded based on his own stories of his family, is that a young William or Bill Barr stayed at the same camp at the same time and in the same cabin as a young Jeffrey Epstein. If you don't believe me, just take a look at this photo. Now, the camp denies that these two were there at the same time, but that seems extremely difficult to believe. I mean, this is literally a picture of a young William Barr. You can't convince me otherwise. Which would then explain how Epstein got hired to work at the Dalton School after dropping out of college. Considering that Donald Barr, the man whose son is depicted in the camp photo with Epstein, is who hired Epstein to work at the Dalton School, and then was subsequently forced out of his position as principal of the Dalton School for delinquency prior to Epstein's first day. And we all know that Epstein, while the Dalton School, began to prey on minors, breaking the dress code and wearing open shirts, hitting on the young girls at school and showing up to their parties, including when children were intoxicated, and flirting with them. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence and has nothing to do with what happened later in life. However, before I get too far ahead of myself, it is worth noting that Donald Barr is not only the father of William Barr, the future Attorney General for Donald Trump, but he was also a high-ranking member of the OSS, which is the predecessor to our current three-letter agencies. His particular role with the OSS is slightly unclear, but for all intents and purposes, he was a spy during World War II. In the post-war world, Donald Barr continued his work as a spy after the war for a little bit, and then ostensibly took on the role as a teacher and would spend most of his life either teaching or being taught. That is on the surface at least, because in his free time, Donald wrote 2 books. Most sources will tell you it was only one though, and the first one that most are willing to admit to is entitled Space Relations, which if I were to sum up in about 2 sentences is a book about an intergalactic civilization where there are elites on various worlds who engage in the rape and sex trafficking of children and other unwitting individuals. Really can't make this up, and the reason for this behavior is because they've become too wealthy, bored, and powerful, so that they have nothing else to do except for to destroy the innocence of children. And yes, that does sound like a very, very thinly veiled metaphor for the exact same stuff Epstein would then later engage in, except for not an intergalactic civilization, but an intercontinental organization. Mind you, Donald Barr penned this same text about raping little boys and girls while serving as the headmaster of the Dalton School in 1973. But it's the second book named A Planet in Arms that Donald Barr wrote, which I find to be far more revealing of Donald's intentions, and most certainly a direct hint as to what he knew. This is the cover of the book in question, which is already problematic. However, before I read a passage from this book, there are a few things I need you to keep in mind. This book was written by the father of the future Attorney General and principal of the Dalton School, Donald Barr, who hired Jeffrey Epstein. This same man was once a deep state operative and was well connected enough to be hand-selected by Ronald Reagan to be a member of the National Council on Educational Research. That all in mind, the following passage is heavily viewer discretion advised. If you have a child in the room, now's the time to have them leave. So for context, here's what's happening. An adult male named Coriander has just grabbed a politician's young daughter off a stage where she is forced to perform sexual rituals by corrupt high-ranking members of the police, military, and government, as well as wealthy individuals who are just currently watching her for their own pleasure. Coriander is now carrying this girl upstairs, fondling her and laughing. He then takes this girl, who's on his shoulders, into her bedroom, puts her on the bed, and then asks her a very intriguing question, and that being, are there any microphones listening to them? And if you've seen the Zorro Ranch video, this should be ringing some serious bells for you. The girl then answers this question by saying, yes, there are people listening to them. However, she says something interesting as well, that there are also cameras in the room, and that they are being watched by what she refers to as viewers, which is when the following scene takes place. She had taken off the shoes and sat on the cot with her bare heels digging into the mattress, her arms around her knees, regarding him gravely. Coriander felt a pang almost like grief, but totally happy at the sight, the whole enchanting underside of her that her position brought into view, the black gloved arms, the wide solemn eyes of a little girl. "Oh, you liar," she said and laughed, but her eyes watched him. He sat down on the edge of the cot, facing her, put his hands on her shoulders, and made her lie back, laid his head between her breasts, and whispered, "They're specials. They know you're Simon's daughter, but the fairy's trying to bluff them. He says Simon's daughter wouldn't be a whore, and he's got them nervous. 2 of them in the house." Her susurration was barely audible. "So I've got to be a real whore? Coriander, you've got to act like a real whore. Citizen Wells, then I'd better take off my gloves." As she removed them, he began to undress. But she said, "I'll do that." Her way of doing it was a pastiche of shamelessness. "You're going to find me a rather surprising whore," she whispered ambiguously as she invaded his privacies daintily. He found himself saying helplessly, "Oh, how I love you, how I love you." He kissed the most astonishing parts of her anatomy. A few minutes later, he discovered he was taking a virginity. The shock froze him. "Keep going, you bull," she gritted in a whisper through clenched teeth. The viewers in the ceiling. Her eyes were swimming in tears. He kissed them and kept going. When he at last fell forward on her, she put her arms around him gently and said nothing. He could feel a tremor in her jaw, however, and knew she was in pain. Yet she rolled him over and, putting on a display of loud, desperate lewdness, forced herself and him to all sorts of gross exertions. Oh my goodness, I'm sick. Okay, I am truly sorry you had to hear that, but it is important for us to be literally on the same page about who and what we are dealing with. This is what Donald Barr was thinking about and writing about while teaching children. And so I wonder if he had a particular student in mind for this scene where a man rapes a little girl. Imagine if you found out that your child's teacher was writing this. What would you do? And to think this is the same man who once again hired Epstein, a fellow that would later go on to bring the wealthy and powerful to his various estates where on camera and audio, they will be lured into disgusting acts with children. This literally just happened in this book and in vivid detail. That's not okay. That's inexcusable. Clearly Donald Barr, the covert spy for the American government, knew something. And yet these 2 books were written well before the earliest accounts of Epstein's malfeasance, making me wonder if perhaps Epstein didn't begin the infamous ring that has destroyed the lives of thousands, but inherited it. because Donald Barr wrote that first book while Epstein was still a teacher at the Dalton School. Now, the book I just read to you continues for almost 300 pages, and this is not the only rape that occurs. It happens more times than I care to count. There are, and you're not going to believe this, worse scenes than that take place in this book. Indeed, there is a scene where 8 schoolgirls, and he uses the word schoolgirls, are kidnapped from their school, taken away, stripped completely, raped, and then returned to the school naked. That's not okay, and the fact that he hired Epstein, who went to camp with his son, is such an obvious link that it cannot be ignored. And so what I think we have solved for is the question of how Epstein managed to get a job at the Dalton School, one of the most prestigious schools for youths in New York, but truly in America, without even a single bit of a degree. It should also cast infinitely more doubt on the Epstein investigation as a whole, because the Attorney General who oversaw it was not only the longtime friend of Epstein's, but was the son of a man who was writing pedophile literature. I mean, typically you're required to recuse yourself for circumstances like this. Even having a relative, a distant one, involved in a case like this would be suspicious. But your dad, dude, hired the guy, and you were best friends with him. And all of this is probably why Bill Barr closed the Epstein investigation and declared it a suicide before the investigation had even concluded. And this is also why it's so important for us to continue asking questions, you guys, because certainly this has answered some of the mysteries behind Epstein and where he got his start from. And if there's one thing I hope you get from this, whether or not some of my speculation is true, we do know some things for facts. That there is absolutely zero chance Epstein was some random Jewish kid from Brooklyn who just happened to become this massive monster. He was a well-connected individual beginning in his youth, and we can be certain that these connections run even deeper than we now know. Epstein is a very unique case in that so little is known about his childhood, about his family life, and his general upbringing. And for my own ease of research, Ghislaine is a much different story, admittedly, at least in terms of who her family was. And so to truly understand Ghislaine Maxwell, we honestly don't even have to dive into her so much as we do her father, because a lot of who she is obvious based on who her dad is. And her father is a man by the name of Robert Maxwell. Robert was a Jewish man who spent most of his life in Britain, where he raised a family of 9 children and is a massive rabbit hole in and of himself. I mean, the man's death alone warrants a multi-hour long video. Over about 40 years, Robert amassed a massive fortune, estimated at over $1 billion, owned much of the news media, and made several successful political bids, and used his grip on the sensationalist newspapers he owned to sway public opinion every which way he wished. And what he wished happened to also almost always co-align with the government of Israel. It's rather well known, or at least not denied at this point, that Maxwell was an agent of the Mossad. For the sake of time, I'll give you the SparkNotes version of some of his greatest hits, but rest assured, there are more of them than we will ever know about. The first incident occurs in the late 1970s and early 1980s. During this time, the governments of the world wanted to buy a new, more refined and expedient way of managing legal cases and documents, which typically you might think would be fairly mundane stuff. And after receiving some government investments, there was a company named Insta that had set out to do just this and had developed a phenomenal software that went above and beyond with what the government could have wanted. This program was named as PROMIS, P-R-O-M-I-S. It was extremely advanced for its time, ran on the most high-tech computer systems, and allowed the government oversight for the management of legal cases across the country. Well, the US Department of Justice didn't want to pay for it, and so they decided to steal the software, and succeeded. The company who developed the program, Insta, that we discussed, would end up taking the US government to court over this matter, and in bankruptcy court, they actually won and were rewarded damages for what the government had done. But they were overturned, and Insta, the people who wrote the code, won nothing, and were put out of business. After this, there were not one but 2 congressional investigations into the case and what happened to PROMIS software and who was behind it all. And both investigations were obviously won by the government and in the government's favor, which is a shocker when you ask the government to investigate itself. Oh wow, they found that they did nothing wrong. Right now, as I tell you this story, let's take a break. If you had to bet, who do you think was in charge of these 2 congressional investigations into the PROMIS software scandal? You have 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. William Barr, Epstein's old camp buddy and the son of the pedo author, was in charge of these 2 congressional investigations into PROMIS software. You really can't even make this stuff up. But where the scandal truly begins is that Israel got their hands on this thing and cracked it wide open, changing the program so that they had a backdoor access into anyone who was using this software and what their database contained. And then Israel, using Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, as the spokesman, sold this software to 80 different countries and a whole host of companies we've lost count. So Israel now had access to not only all of these countries' legal cases and these companies' legal cases, but much, much more. Because the same thing that made Instalaw's Promise software so good at legal cases also made it exceptional at just about every other kind of monitoring. So now Israel had a database that gave them control and insight into almost everything going on in these countries, including monitoring foreign assets, intelligence agencies, citizens, financial transactions, all sorts of things. To this day, we don't even really know the limits of what this program can do. And all of this, it's worth reiterating, was because of Robert Maxwell and his wonderful work on behalf of the Israeli government. But that is not nearly my favorite of Maxwell's works. I think his most prominent example that does not get enough attention is the cover-up of the illegal Israeli nuclear program that he was involved in. Now, this may be news to you. You might have been unaware that Israel does possess nuclear bombs. The whole process has been one giant scandal that's been kept from most people's eyes. The government of Israel, rather than enriching their own uranium illegally, just decided to steal it from the United States in one of our uranium enrichment facilities. And this scandal is known as the Apollo Affair, which is a critically undiscussed topic. Most nuclear engineers don't even know this happened. And would you believe it, Robert Maxwell was a huge player in this. For several years, Israel had actually gotten away with stealing this nuclear material, and the United States government let it happen. But this wouldn't work for long because one day an Israeli nuclear technician by the name of Mordecai Vanunu got a little suspicious of what was going on and grew a conscience. It got to the point that Mordecai couldn't continue working there without doing something, and so he decided that he was going to plan a time to come in when no one else was there, and he was going to bring his camera and begin taking photos of everything that was going on. His goal was to get enough photos of the various items in the production facility so that he could prove to another government and to other scientists that this really was going on and it wasn't just a lie. While the mission was a success, Mordecai was able to get in, take his pictures, and get out, and then leave his job and head outside of the country. However, upon taking that flight out of Israel, Mordecai began wondering, man, should I really do this? This could ruin my entire life. And so for an extended period of time, he traveled on a sort of sabbatical across the world, eventually ending up in Australia. And it's here where Mordecai had a conversion from Judaism to Christianity and became a follower of Christ. And it's also here where Mordecai met a group of Christians who, once he discussed what he had seen in Israel, they said, man, you should really bring this to the public. And so Mordecai got in contact with a London newspaper. Now, this newspaper requested that Mordecai come in person and show them the photographs so that they could confirm the validity before they put all their eggs in this basket of revealing this illegal nuclear program. And Mordecai relented and traveled all the way over to London from Australia. Upon arriving there, he met with several scientists and executives from these companies, and they said, oh my goodness, this is insane, it's real, this program's happening. And so Mordecai kind of thought he was all set. But some interesting things took place after this. At a certain point while Mordecai was in London, he came across a woman named Cheryl. Now Cheryl was an American tourist and had invited Mordecai to come with her to Rome the following week. Mordecai thought he was in love and thought she was in love with him, so you know what? He said, I'm gonna go over there to Rome. Except for it turns out Cheryl was not an American tourist, but she was an Israeli Mossad operative. And alongside several other people, he was kidnapped, drugged, and sent all the way back to Israel. The whole way back to Israel, the drug that he had been injected with completely paralyzed him, so he was just left there to suffer. And then once he actually made it to Israel and got put on land, his suffering only increased dramatically. He was illegally sentenced to 18 years in prison, 11 of which were illegally served as solitary confinement. Think about that. 11 years of solitary confinement. And then eventually upon his release in 2004, Mordecai didn't really get a much better situation. He was always kept under guard, was not allowed to talk with any journalists, and was not allowed to leave Israel. And the punishment for breaking any of these rules was to be thrown back into prison, which has happened several times. Now, this is a wild story, but what does Maxwell have to do with this, you ask? Well, Robert Maxwell used not only his newspapers to cover up any hints of this story, he also lended a helping hand in the form of sending his foreign editor, Nicholas Davies, to go all the way to Rome to help in the abduction of this poor, poor man. And the reason it happened in Rome is because Israel was worried about ruining its relationship with Britain by abducting someone from their soil. So since Mordecai left of his own volition to go to Rome, everything was a-okay in the minds of the Israeli and Mossad agents. And to this day, Mordecai still continues to suffer at the hands of the Israeli government. All because he revealed the truth that Israel was developing illegal nuclear weapons, which they still have today, and nothing has been done about it. So all this is to say that Ghislaine Maxwell, the other half of the pedo ring that was dedicated to destroying and blackmailing the wealthy and powerful, was the daughter of an Israeli Mossad agent who had been one of their most fierce warriors and loyalists. This is admittedly not a great look for her. However, as the 1980s became the 1990s, things began to change. Robert Maxwell could sense the shifting sands beneath his feet. And if there's one thing Robert Maxwell was known for, it was pivoting. And part of this pivot was introducing his daughter Ghislaine to someone by the name of Jeffrey Epstein. That's right, Ghislaine met Jeffrey Epstein through her own father. And this connection between the Maxwell family and Epstein was critical. At this point, Maxwell's Pergamon press, named after Satan's throne, was hemorrhaging cash like crazy, and the stock price of the company was in dire straits. So Maxwell had taken $450 million from his company's pension fund and tried to use that to prop up his company. But that had failed, so he took what was left of it and had to put it somewhere. Obviously, he couldn't keep it with himself, so he had taken it and placed it with this guy named Jeffrey Epstein. Now, much of this is what we have to assume, because it's not like they were writing down, oh, I'm going to take this illegal money and I'm going to give it to this guy who does these illegal things with children. But we do know that Ghislaine was sent by her father Robert to New York to, in his own words, look over the new paper he'd just bought and manage it, but in reality was making pretty close connections with the most powerful in New York, including Jeffrey Epstein. And it does explain how Ghislaine very quickly became friends with Epstein, but also quickly got into the circles of Prince Andrew and Donald Trump, despite having just arrived on American shores. It does suggest that there was a prior connection between Epstein and Ghislaine for sure. And Robert Maxwell, having handed Epstein a ton of cash, would also answer the age-old question of who else is on the list besides Les Wexner of Epstein clients. And I think Robert Maxwell is a really, really fair answer. So now we know at least 2 people who were on that list for sure. But what's even more clear from this entire experience is that Robert was doomed. At least from our perspective. By 1991, the cat was out of the bag, the public knew that the money was gone, and that Robert was doing something with it, and most people understood that this money was probably enriching Robert himself at this point. And so official investigations had begun into Robert, but this wasn't the first time he had suffered such a loss, so he wasn't really distressed about it because he knew he had options. After all, this business was but one part of who Robert Maxwell was. The other part was the Mossad agent, and the other part was also the double agent for both Russia and the United States. He was actually a man who was not really trusted by any country, but however it happened to be that he most often worked for Israel. And that's also likely what Robert Maxwell saw as his get-out-of-jail-free card. He couldn't pay back these debts, but he certainly had a lot of great information that these other governments like the Brits and the Americans might want to know. And at this point, I want to say there's a method to my madness, and there's a reason why I went into those 2 stories of what Maxwell did for the Israeli government and the Mossad. It's true that he had an affinity and a seeming loyalty for the state of Israel, but most of what he did was because he had a lust for power and wealth. In fact, there were few things he loved more than that in life, and his family was not one of them, except for one exception. That being his prized daughter, Ghislaine. She had grown up, unlike the rest of her siblings, as the apple of his eye. And she had the opportunity to watch every single one of his moves and learn from the best. I mean, it is worth noting that in World War II, you guessed it, Robert Maxwell served as a spy. And so it's no wonder that Ghislaine would take after her father in so many regards. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. On November the 5th of 1991, while on board his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, Robert Maxwell would make a call to the captain at 4:45 a.m., complaining that his room was too chilly. And then after that, no one heard from Robert ever again. And that would be because 12 hours later, a fisherman would find Robert Maxwell's body floating in the water, stiff as a board, and bare naked, 15 miles from where his yacht had originally been. Initially, it was presumed that the man who would often pee nude from his boat in the roof of his skyscraper had simply fallen in, but that was quickly proven untrue. 3 medical experts conducted autopsies and inspected the body, finding that he had fractured skull, damaged left shoulder, abdomen, and spinal cord. The examiners could never agree on the cause of death and were rushed, very much so by outside governments, I'll let you pick out which one, to come up with a convenient answer to what happened. And so they would end up labeling Robert's death as a heart attack followed by a drowning. But no one who worked on the body even believed that. One professor named Louis Le Revelot, who saw the body, said that, quote, "It is highly probable that the victim was struck by a violent blow to the back of the skull. But that just means that he was snuffed out by someone. It doesn't necessarily specify whom." However, there was another interesting detail that gives us much more insight. In addition to the obvious signs of violence in Robert's body, there was a much less conspicuous, tiny little hole, or perforation, behind his ear from a syringe that had been inserted there. And in the words of the eminent physician Carlos Lopez de la Mela of Spain's National Toxicological Institute, he says, quote, the perforation could have been caused by a syringe filled with some mortal substance, we certainly haven't ruled out the possibility of foul play. And what the good doctor leaves out is that this is one of the Mossad's classic methods for taking someone out and making it look like a suicide or an accident rather than what it is, that being a murder. And for the sake of reference, here's a story of when the Mossad tried to do this and failed, and because of it, kind of gave away their whole tactic. A little excerpt from the article reads as follows. On September the 25th of 1997, 5 Mossad agents entered Jordan disguised as Canadian tourists. Their mission, assassinate Khalid Mashal, a 41-year-old operative of the Islamic Resistance Movements, or Hamas. Their method, a page out of Hamlet, injecting poison in Khalid's ear. Now, I'm not sure how 5 agents managed to fail taking out one guy, so without a doubt, Robert was taken out by the Mossad, and in all likelihood, for what he knew and was going to expose. Clearly, however, this was a botched mission, and it was not meant to end up with both an injection mark and a severe beating to Maxwell. And so I wager that in this instance, the Mossad messed up. What they likely didn't calculate for is that poison is subjective, and some people need more than others, especially when the people are enormous. And putting it politely, Robert Maxwell was a heifer. His nickname from other newspapers was the bouncing check because he was fat and a check. And not creative, but pretty hilarious. Ghislane's connection to Mossad then, based on this, is pretty obvious in my mind. There is a great book though on it on screen now if you want to check it out. I mean, I haven't read it yet, but I've heard some pretty great things about it, and it dives more deeply into how Robert trained Ghislaine, but that's essentially what we're talking about here. Most of Ghislaine's life was spent following around her father, and obviously Ghislaine was truly the apple of her dad's eye, and he wanted her to take over everything, but we do know that the Israeli and Mossad connection continued well into Ghislaine and Epstein's work. After all, the former Prime Minister of the Government of Israel visited Ghislaine and Epstein 30 separate times, even after Epstein was convicted of various offenses against children. And based on how Ghislaine ended up and how deeply connected she was to the rich and powerful, as well as her and Epstein's affair, it really is no wonder, or really even a question, that she was trained by her father, and to a part of the Mossad to some degree or fashion. After all, it's very interesting that Roberts, despite being killed by his own people, was then given a state funeral, which was attended by 6 heads and former heads of the Mossad, numerous members of the Israeli government, and oh yeah, the Israelis flew Roberts' corpse via private airplane to Israel from the ocean he was found in to give him a practically royal funeral where they buried him in the Mount of Olives, the place where Jesus prayed in the Bible prior to his crucifixion, and where the government of Israel now buries its greatest allies. But the Mossad and Israel connections, that would be a whole nother video in its own right, which is out of the scope of this one. If you do want to see a video on that topic, Epstein and Ghislaine and the Israel connection, comment below and I would be happy to make it. All right, guys. This was a long video. It is part 2 of the Epstein. I don't normally do a part 2 video series that quickly, but I thought you guys might have liked it based on the last one, so I hope you did. And if you did, be sure to comment the part that you found the most interesting down below. This was a long video, and I'm debating taking a break from Epstein, unless you guys really show me that you would like another video. It's just a lot to do with that depressing of a topic over and over and over, but it is interesting, so if you guys want more, just let me know, and I'll happily make another one. That being said, I want to give a special shout out to all the Patreon members. Thank you for your extra support, most specifically Paul, who just carries over there. He's the man. With that, I want to thank everyone who's joined the Discord. We're over 300 members now, which is incredible, and I gained like 30 followers on the Instagram account. That's awesome. Thank you so much, you guys. The Minecraft server's also been popping off, and that's great. Really quickly though, I want to say thank you guys for everything you're doing for the channel. We've gained 8,000 subscribers in a week, which is crazy, and I appreciate every single one of you guys for being here. It really does mean the world that you guys like watching what I do, and I hope to continue doing it for a very long time. So if you guys are down to have me, we'll get into some interesting topics. That being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to every single one of you guys who took the time out of your day to spend it here watching this. I really appreciate it. That being said, I can't wait to see each and every one of you in the next one.